going to talk about the question, does God exist? And specifically explain why it is not a simple question. Rather, the question, does God exist, is in many respects like the question, is it day or is it night? There are cases where it is clearly day, there are cases where it is clearly night, and there's a whole range of fuzzy cases where it's not entirely clear at that moment whether it is day or night. It's very similar when we talk about the existence of God. So think about it like this. Think about a continuum. And at one end of the continuum, you have a concept of something metaphysical that exists beyond creatures or human beings or nature. So you have something that exists beyond nature in some respect, and it is very transcendent and non-personal or impersonal. So that's one end of the continuum. At the other end of the continuum, you have something that is immanent and very personal. So at this extreme, the impersonal transcendent end, you would have, for example, a concept of a metaphysical being that is like a Platonic absolute. That would mean that it is outside time, it is outside space, it is immaterial, it is metaphysically necessary, and it is not an agent. In other words, it doesn't interact with any created things, it doesn't have intentions or mind, it doesn't act with any purpose or bring about any states of affairs. It can be exemplified in concrete particulars, which is what happens with universals, right? Like the universal, let's say, of redness. If there is a universal of redness, then it is instantiated or exemplified in many things that are red. For example, in the font of this book that I just reviewed the other day, but it doesn't bring about any states of affairs. And that's the one extreme. So at the continuum, the extreme of the highly transcendent and impersonal, you'd have the Platonic absolute. At the other extreme here, you'd have very immanent and personal. So, for example, you could have a creature that somehow transcends created being, the universe, human beings, but it is contingent. It evolved and developed over time, and, and maybe it lacks all knowledge, and it is mutable. It changes, etc. So it's really, in some respects, like a glorified creature, very much like the quote unquote gods that we would talk about, let's say in ancient Greece or Rome, or actually, in some respects, maybe the concept of God in Mormonism would be somewhere along there, because that is a creature who used to be human and gradually evolved and became very exalted and powerful. It is nothing like the absolute at the other end. Now, most concepts of theism are going to be somewhere in that continuum. So they're not probably going to be the Platonic absolute, because that's doesn't seem to most people to be what you would say makes someone a theist, is belief in universals or a Platonic absolute, because that seems to lack something in terms of agency or power or personhood or conscious awareness or something like that, that most people think to be quite essential to what it is for there to be a God. At the other extreme, you could have something, it might just seem like a glorified creature. So if you only believed that the kind of being that existed was like something similar to one of the Greek gods, a finite, powerful being, you again might be inclined to think the person who believes in that being is not a theist. Most people who are going to call themselves theists are going to find themselves somewhere along that line at that continuum between the hyper transcendent and impersonal, and the hyper immanent and very personal. And so they're going to have a concept of God where God is somewhat like us in terms of being a personal being, but also in somewhat not like us in terms of transcending material reality, but also transcending even concepts of personhood, such as maybe the experience of the flow of time, or of lacking knowledge and having the experience of learning, suffering, various other things. God is deprived of those, one or more of those concepts along that continuum. Where you then end up being along that continuum is going to be where you place theism broadly. And those things, the further out you get in terms of extreme from wherever you find yourself on that continuum, at some point you're going to get to a conception that you would no longer consider sufficient to qualify one as a theist. So once you get out to the Platonic abstracta, you would no longer think that qualifies a person as a theist, belief in that. And likewise, the other extreme, if you think that person just believes in a glorified creature, then that would no longer qualify that individual as being a theist. So when we say, does God exist? We're saying some kind of being along this continuum, does that being exist? And it's not entirely clear precisely what that is. Now, before I conclude, I just want to make one example of a comment. Some person might think, for example, well, let's say all you need is to say that God is whatever creature created the universe. If there's a creature that created the universe, then that creature would satisfy the definition for there being a God. You might think that's a satisfactory explanation, but that explanation is actually pretty far out here on the immanent side and the personal side. For example, that would allow for a scenario in which what is called a type 3 civilization emerged and gradually evolved at some distant point in the past of space-time history. And when you have a type 3 civilization, they have sufficiently advanced technology that they can bring about the existence of new universes. And so on that account, simply for a creature to have evolved to develop the technological ability to create a new universe would qualify them as being a god by that definition. Most people then are going to shrink back from that and think, well, maybe that's not inadequate, not adequately elevated, transcendent in the conception of deity for that to qualify as being a divine being. So that's just one example that often it's much more complicated than we think when we look to answer the question, does God exist? That is going to depend upon one specific definition of God or the range of variation that is allowed along the continuum for one to recognize all beings within that range to qualify as God. That's why, for me, the question, does God exist, is very much like the question, is it day or is it night? It really is going to depend. And just like all those liminal cases in the period, let's say, of dusk, or of dawn. So there will be liminal cases when it comes to theism where it's not entirely clear whether that person is in fact a theist or not based upon the concept of a metaphysical being that they accept.